A brass sombrero the size of a dinner plate hung on a wall in El Paso for 49 years. Nobody thought twice about it. In 2024, a collector at a swap meet paid $1,200 for it. It cost $3 in 1975. That sombrero is number 1 on this list. Number 14 sold for nearly $8,000 at auction last year. Number 9 sat in your abuela's kitchen window for decades, and a single one in original glass now sells for $400. These 25 items were designed for one thing: pride. They filled living rooms and kitchens in Mexican households across Texas, California, and the entire Southwest. Items your family kept not because they were valuable, but because they meant something. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down the 25 vintage items from Mexican households that are worth millions now. Number 25. Brass sombrero wall decorations. Every Mexican living room had a wall that told a story, and the brassy sombrero was the opening line. These stamped brass trays shaped like sombreros hung above couches, next to family portraits, beside crucifixes. They cost $2 to $5 at swap meets in the 1970s. Most came from small metalworking shops in Juarez and Guadalajara. The designs ranged from simple hammered patterns to elaborate scenes of charros on horseback. Some had cactus engravings around the brim. Some had Aztec calendars pressed into the center. Collectors now pay $200 to $1,200 for pieces in good condition, with examples from before 1960 from Taxco commanding the highest prices. A single brass sombrero with original patina and no dents sold on eBay in 2024 for $950. Your tia probably still has one hanging in the same spot it has been in since 1973. She does not know what it is worth. She just knows the wall would look empty without it. Number 24. Velvet paintings. The velvet painting was not art to the people who hung it. It was family. An Elvis on velvet meant your mother loved rock and roll. A Virgen de Guadalupe on velvet meant your abuela was watching over the house. A Last Supper on velvet meant faith was not something you kept private. These paintings came from studios in Ciudad Juarez, where artists worked assembly lines producing hundreds a week. Tourists bought them at border crossings for $5 to $15 in the 1960s and the 1970s. Now a signed Juarez velvet from that era sells for between $200 and $2,000. A large Last Supper velvet in an original carved wood frame sold at auction in 2023 for $1,700. The Lucha Libre velvets are among the rarest. One authenticated El Santo velvet from 1968 sold privately for $3,200. Even damaged velvets with faded colors sell for $50 to $100 if the subject is right. The velvet soaked up cigarette smoke, cooking grease, and decades of sunlight. It did not matter. The image stayed. Number 23. Mexican Coca-Cola glass bottles. The green glass Coca-Cola bottle from Mexico tasted different, and every Mexican kid knew it. It was made with cane sugar, not corn syrup. The glass was heavier. The curve of the bottle felt like something built to last. In the 1970s, a bottle of Mexican Coke cost 25 cents at the tiendita. Those original green bottles from the 1950s and the 1960s are now collectible. Unopened bottles from that era sell for between $75 and $500, depending on the bottling plant stamped on the base. A sealed 1957 Coca-Cola bottle from the Monterrey plant sold on eBay in 2024 for $430. Even empty bottles from the 1960s with original caps fetch $50 to $100. The Coca-Cola company changed the formula for Mexico in 2013, and that made the original bottles even more desirable. Every Mexican family had a case in the garage or under the kitchen sink for special occasions. The bottles clinked when you opened the door. That sound was the sound of a Saturday. No one outside a Mexican household understood the plastic. The couch was beautiful. The plastic kept it that way. Every abuela in San Antonio, every tia in East LA, every mother in the Rio Grande Valley wrapped her furniture the day it arrived, and never took the covers off. Those thick vinyl slipcovers from companies like Curly and Continental stuck to your legs in summer and crinkled when you sat down. Visitors peeled themselves off the couch when they stood up. Kids slid across them in socks. A brand new set cost $10 to $20 in the 1970s. Now vintage Curly furniture covers in original packaging sell for between $100 and $300 on collector sites. The reason is simple. Nobody saved the packaging. Everyone used them until they cracked. A sealed set of Curly couch covers from 1974 sold for $275 in 2023. The plastic your family thought was embarrassing turned out to be the collector piece. Number 21. Lili Ledy Star Wars figures. In the late 1970s and the early 1980s, a company called Ledy manufactured Star Wars action figures in Mexico. They were not exact copies of the American Kenner versions. The plastic was slightly different, and the paint was sometimes brighter. The cards they came on were printed in Spanish. Most Mexican kids who owned them had no idea they were playing with something that would become one of the most valuable toy lines in the world. A loose Lili Ledy Boba Fett figure now sells for between $500 and $5,000, depending on condition. A sealed Lili Ledy Darth Vader on the original card sold at auction for nearly $8,000. The most valuable Lili Ledy figure ever recorded was a sealed Boba Fett that sold for over $77,000. These were the same toys that sat in shoeboxes under beds in Laredo, Brownsville, and McAllen. Kids traded them in schoolyards for baseball cards and candy. Nobody saved the packaging. Nobody kept the receipts. Number 20. Vintage Talavera pottery. Talavera was not something you bought at a department store. It came from Puebla. It was hand-painted, and it sat in the center of your abuela's dining table like a crown. The blue and white designs had been passed down through generations of potters since the 16th century. A small Talavera plate cost $5 to $10 at a Mexican market in the 1970s. Authentic vintage Talavera from certified Puebla workshops now sells for between $300 and $3,000. The key is the maker's mark on the bottom. Pieces from the Uriarte workshop, one of the oldest certified producers, command the highest prices. A pair of vintage Uriarte Talavera vases from the 1960s sold on first dibs in 2024 for $2,800. But here is the thing that matters. Your grandmother did not buy Talavera because it was expensive. She bought it because it reminded her of home. And that is exactly why collectors want it now. The emotional weight of these pieces, the way they carry a whole kitchen, a whole family, a whole geography inside their glaze, is what drives the market. Every chip and crack tells a story of decades of use. The Talavera in your family was never behind glass. It was on the table. It held salsa. It held fruit. It held the center of every Sunday gathering. That is what makes it irreplaceable. The potters in Puebla used techniques that arrived with Spanish colonists in the 1500s and mixed them with indigenous clay traditions that were already ancient. Every plate is a record of two civilizations meeting in one kitchen. Number 19. Hojalata tin art frames. Hojalata is the Spanish word for tin plate, and in Mexican households it was everywhere. Tin frames held family photographs. Tin mirrors hung in bathrooms. Tin nichos sheltered saints. The craft dates back to the colonial era, when Mexican artisans recycled tin cans into decorative objects that turned scrap metal into something sacred. A Hojalata frame from an Oaxacan workshop cost $3 to $8 in the 1970s. Vintage Hojalata made before 1970 now sells for between $150 and $2,000. A hand-punched tin mirror frame from Oaxaca, dated to the 1940s, sold for $1,800 at a folk art auction in Santa Fe in 2023. The older the piece, the more detailed the cutout patterns, the higher the price. Some frames had hearts punched around the border, some had crosses. The tin caught the light and threw it back across the room. It made even a small house feel alive. Number 18. Loteria card sets. Loteria was not just a game. It was a Saturday night ritual. The caller shouted the riddles. The family crowded around the kitchen table. The prize was usually nothing more than bragging rights and a second serving of pan dulce. The cards themselves were works of art, hand-painted images of La Sirena, El Diablo, La Luna, El Catrín. A standard Loteria set cost less than $1 in the 1960s. Hand-painted sets from the early 20th century now sell for between $200 and $1,500. A complete hand-painted Loteria set from the 1930s sold on first dibs for $1,200. Even mass-produced sets from the 1950s with original packaging sell for $75 to $200. The images are iconic. They appear on murals and tattoos and t-shirts now. But the original cards, the ones your abuela kept in a cigar box in the back of the closet, those are the ones that collectors search for. The ink has faded. The edges are soft. And every card smells like the house it came from. Number 17. Virgen de Guadalupe prayer candles. The tall glass candle with the image of La Virgen sat in your abuela's kitchen window, on the nightstand, on the shelf above the stove. It burned during storms. It burned during illness. It burned when someone in the family needed protection. The flame meant somebody was praying. A prayer candle cost 25 to 50 cents in the 1970s. Vintage glass prayer candles from that era with original paper labels and intact glass are now collectible. Undamaged examples from the 1960s and the 1970s sell for between $75 and $400. The hand-painted glass versions from before 1960, produced by small religious goods shops in San Antonio and Los Angeles, are the rarest. One hand-painted Guadalupe candle from a San Antonio shop, dated to the 1940s, sold at auction for $375 in 2024. The wax is long gone. The prayer is still inside the glass. Number 16. Pedro Infante movie posters. Pedro Infante was more than a movie star. He was the voice that came out of every radio in every Mexican household in the 1940s and the 1950s. His face hung on walls the way a family portrait would. When he died in 1957, an entire generation lost someone who felt like family. Original movie posters from the golden age of Mexican cinema were printed on thin, fragile paper. Most were thrown away after a week. The ones that survived are now among the most sought-after pieces of Mexican pop culture memorabilia. An original linen-backed poster for Nosotros los Pobres from 1948 sold for $3,200 in 2023. Cantinflas posters from the same era sell for between $500 and $2,000. A Pedro Infante lobby card set in good condition fetches between $300 and $800. These posters were never meant to last. They were meant to advertise a film and then disappear. The fact that a few survived inside Mexican homes is what makes them priceless. The golden age of Mexican cinema produced some of the most beautiful poster art in the world. And most of it was created by anonymous artists whose names were never printed on the paper. The colors were richer than Hollywood posters. The compositions were bolder, and the faces on them belonged to people who looked like your family. That is the reason collectors pay thousands, not because the paper is rare, because the feeling is. A poster of Pedro Infante on a bedroom wall in Brownsville carried the same weight as a portrait of a saint. He represented what a Mexican man could become. He sang about love and loss and home, and his face, frozen at 39, never aged while the families who hung his poster grew old around it. Number 15. Lucha Libre masks. The mask was sacred in Lucha Libre. Losing it in a match meant losing your identity. For Mexican kids growing up in the 1960s and the 1970s, owning an El Santo mask or a Blue Demon mask was like owning a piece of mythology. The silver fabric of El Santo's mask was to him what a cape was to Superman, Original wrestling masks from that era, the ones actually worn in the ring or produced by the same shops that supplied the wrestlers, are now among the most valuable pieces of Mexican sports memorabilia. An authenticated El Santo ring-worn mask sold at auction for over $10,000. Vintage Blue Demon masks from the 1970s in good condition sell for between $500 and $3,000. Even mass-produced masks from that era, the kind your primo bought at the mercado for $2, now sell for $75 to $300 if they are in original condition. El Santo was buried in his mask. He never showed his face in public. That commitment to the character is what made the mask more than fabric. Number 14. Saltillo Serape Blankets. The Saltillo Serape draped over the back of the couch was not just a blanket, it was a map. The colors told you where it came from. The weave told you who made it. The diamond pattern in the center was a signature that dated back centuries to the weavers of Coahuila. A Saltillo Serape cost $15 to $30 at a border market in the 1970s. Now vintage Saltillo Serapes from before 1950 sell for between $500 and $4,800. The average selling price on first dibs is $1,375. A hand-woven 19th century Saltillo Serape in museum condition sold for $4,800 in 2024. Even serapes from the 1960s and the 1970s now sell for $200 to $500. The wool came from sheep raised in the high desert. The dyes came from cochineal insects and indigo plants. The patterns were memorized, not written down, passed from weaver to weaver across generations like a language without an alphabet. Number 13. Chalkware figurines. The chalkware sat on top of the television set, a rooster, a fruit basket, a flamenco dancer, a pair of Siamese cats. Every Mexican household had at least one. These painted plaster figures were cheap carnival prices and dime store decorations in the 1940s through the 1970s. They cost less than $1. Most were made in Mexico or by Mexican artisans in the Southwest. The paint was bright. The details were rough. And that was the charm. Now vintage chalkware in good condition sells for between $50 and $600 depending on the figure. Large chalkware roosters with original paint sell for up to $400. A pair of vintage chalkware flamenco dancers from the 1950s sold for $550 on eBay in 2024. The paint chips easily, which is why intact pieces are rare. If the rooster on your mother's shelf still has both eyes and a full tail, it is worth more than she thinks. Number 12. Transistor radios with Spanish station dials. The transistor radio sat on the kitchen counter, tuned to the same station every day. Ranchera in the morning, cumbia in the afternoon, novela soundtracks in the evening. In Mexican households, the radio was the heartbeat of the house. It played while your abuela cooked. It played while your grandfather read the paper. It played so constantly that the dial wore smooth where the favorite station sat. Vintage transistor radios from the 1960s and the 1970s, especially models sold through Mexican retailers with Spanish-language station dials and Mexican brand stickers, are now collectible. A working Motorola or Zenith transistor from that era with its original case sells for between $100 and $500. Radios with visible Mexican station frequency labels fetch a premium. A 1968 Zenith transistor with a XERF border blaster sticker sold for $320 in 2024. The border blaster stations broadcast from Mexico with enough power to reach Chicago. Number 11. Molcajetes. The molcajete was not a decoration. It was the most powerful tool in your abuela's kitchen. Carved from volcanic rock, it was used to grind chiles, tomatoes, garlic, and spices into salsa. The older the molcajete, the better the salsa, because decades of grinding seasoned the stone the same way cast iron seasons with oil. A molcajete cost $3 to $5 at a Mexican market in the 1970s. Vintage hand-carved molcajetes from before 1960 now sell for between $150 and $800. The three-legged pig-shaped molcajetes from Oaxaca and Jalisco are the most sought after. A hand-carved molcajete made before 1940 with a matching tejolote sold for $750 at a folk art auction in Tucson in 2023. Here is what makes the molcajete different from everything else on this list. Every other item gained value because people stopped using it. The molcajete gained value because people never stopped. It is one of the only kitchen tools in the world that gets better with age, that carries the flavor of every meal ever made in it, that connects a granddaughter in Phoenix to a grandmother in Michoacan through something as simple as the taste of salsa. The molcajete is not an antique, it is an inheritance. The volcanic rock came from the same mountains that fed the rivers that fed the fields that grew the chiles. It was already ancient when your abuela's grandmother bought it. And it will still be making salsa when your grandchildren are old enough to hold the tejolote. That is not a kitchen tool. That is a timeline carved in stone. Number 10. Ceramic piggy banks. The ceramic piggy bank was a rite of passage. Every Mexican kid had one. It sat on a dresser or a shelf, slowly filling with pennies, nickels, and dimes. The sound of a coin dropping through the slot was the sound of a kid learning patience. When it was full, you broke it. That was the tradition. Which is exactly why the ones that survived unbroken are valuable now. Vintage, hand-painted Mexican ceramic piggy banks from the 1950s and the 1960s sell for between $75 and $500. The larger ones, the ones painted with flowers and bright colors from Tonala or Metepec, fetch the highest prices. An unbroken hand-painted Tonala piggy bank from the 1960s sold for $420 on Etsy in 2024. The irony is beautiful. The whole point was to break it. The ones that lasted are the ones nobody expected to keep. Number 9. Barro Negro pottery. Barro Negro is the black clay pottery from Oaxaca that looks like it was carved from obsidian. The surface is polished until it shines without any glaze. The technique dates back to pre-Hispanic times and was refined by Dona Rosa Real de Nieto in San Bartolo Coyotepec in the 1950s. She discovered that burnishing the clay with a quartz stone before firing created the mirror-like finish that made it famous. A Barro Negro vase cost $2 to $5 at an Oaxacan market in the 1970s. Vintage pieces from the Dona Rosa workshop now sell between $200 and $1,200. A signed Dona Rosa Barro Negro urn from the 1960s sold for $1,100 in 2023. Even unsigned vintage pieces from the same era sell for $150 to $400. The black clay catches light the way nothing else does. It sits on a shelf and looks like a piece of the night sky. Number 8. Chromed lowrider bicycle parts. The lowrider bicycle was more than transportation. It was art on two wheels. In the 1970s and the 1980s, kids across South Texas and East Los Angeles stripped down Schwinn Stingrays and rebuilt them with chromed forks, twisted sissy bars, banana seats wrapped in velvet, and spoke wheels that caught the sun like mirrors. A full lowrider conversion cost about $20 to $50 back then. The chrome came from swap meets. The velvet came from fabric stores. The design came from imagination. These bikes were built by kids with tools borrowed from their fathers. Now original chromed lowrider bicycle parts from that era are highly collectible. A set of original twisted chrome forks from the 1970s sells for between $150 and $600. An original velvet banana seat in good condition fetches $200 to $400. A complete vintage lowrider bicycle in show condition sold at a car show in San Bernardino in 2024 for $3,500. Number 7. Embroidered pillowcases. The embroidered pillowcase was your abuela's art gallery. Flowers, birds, names, dates. She stitched them by hand, often while watching novelas in the evening. Some had lace trim. Some had crocheted edges. Most were too beautiful to sleep on, so they sat on top of the bed as decoration that nobody was allowed to touch. Hand-embroidered Mexican pillowcases from before 1960 now sell for between $40 and $300 per pair. The ones with otomi embroidery from the Tenango de Doria region of Hidalgo command the highest prices. A pair of vintage otomi embroidered pillowcases from the 1950s sold for $280 on Etsy in 2024. Complete embroidered bedding sets from the same era sell for $500 to $1,000. The thread your abuela used cost pennies. The hours she spent were free. But the pillowcases she left behind are worth more than anything she could have bought in a store. Number 6. Mexican teen Christmas ornaments. Every December, the tree in a Mexican household looked different from every other tree on the block. The ornaments were tin, punched and painted stars, angels, suns, moons, and miniature nacimientos cut from recycled tin cans by artisans in Oaxaca and Guanajuato. A box of 12 cost $3 to $5 in the 1970s. Vintage Mexican tin ornaments from before 1970 now sell for between $5 and $40 each, depending on condition and detail. A complete set of 12 vintage hand-painted Oaxacan tin ornaments in its original box sold for $360 in 2023. Individual large star ornaments from the 1950s sell for $25 to $50 each. The tin was recycled from food cans. The paint was applied by hand, and every ornament carried a small piece of the artisan who made it. That is the difference between a decoration and an heirloom. Number 5. Felix the Cat Clocks. The black cat clock with the shifting eyes and swinging tail hung in kitchens across America, and in Mexican households it was practically mandatory. The original Kit Kat clock, made in California since 1932, became a staple of Mexican home decor by the 1960s. A new one cost about $5 in the 1970s. Vintage Kit Kat clocks from the 1950s and the 1960s in working condition now sell for between $150 and $800. The rarer colors, the pink ones, the green ones, and the ones with rhinestone eyes sell for even more. A black Kit Kat clock from the 1950s in its original box with a working mechanism sold for $750 in 2024. The eyes still move, the tail still swings, and the ticking sound it makes is the sound of every Mexican kitchen you walked into as a kid. The clock kept time while your abuela made tortillas. It watched the kitchen for 40 years and never stopped. Number 4. Vintage Jarritos bottles. Jarritos was the soda of the barrio. Tamarind, guava, lime, mandarin. The bottles were thick glass, the labels were bright, and the flavors tasted like nothing sold in American grocery stores. A bottle cost 15 to 25 cents in the 1970s. Original Jarritos glass bottles from before 1970, especially those with embossed logos and original paper labels, now sell for between $50 and $300. A set of 6 original 1960s Jarritos bottles with intact labels sold for $220 on eBay in 2024. The tamarindo flavor in the brown bottle is the most sought after by collectors. Collectors want the bottles, but what they are really buying is the memory of standing outside a tiendita on a Saturday afternoon with a cold Jarritos in your hand and nowhere to be. Number 3. Abuelita Chocolate Tins. The hexagonal tin with the image of the abuela on the front held the chocolate tablets that made your morning champurrado. Every Mexican kid recognized that tin before they could read. The brand has existed since 1939. The smell of abuelita chocolate dissolving in hot milk was the smell of winter mornings, Dia de los Muertos, and every cold night that ever needed warming. Vintage abuelita tins from the 1950s and the 1960s, especially the larger ones with original paper labels and no rust, sell between $60 and $350. In 1950s, Abuelita tin in near mint condition sold for $320 on eBay in 2023. Even tins from the 1970s and the 1980s in good shape sell for $40 to $100. Most families reuse the tins to store sewing supplies, buttons, or loose change. The chocolate was gone in a week. The tin stayed for a generation. Pause for 1 second. Number 2. Hand-painted wooden crosses. The wooden cross hung on the wall of every bedroom. These hand-painted crosses were painted in bright colors, decorated with flowers, milagros, and sometimes small mirrors. They came from markets in Chiapas, Oaxaca, and Guerrero. A hand-painted cross cost $1 to $3 in the 1970s. Vintage hand-painted Mexican crosses made before 1960 now sell for between $100 and $700. The ones with attached milagros, small metal charms shaped like body parts, eyes, hearts, legs, are the most valuable, because each milagro represented a specific prayer. A grandmother pinned a milagro shaped like a heart for her husband's surgery. A mother pinned one shaped like a leg for her son's recovery. A vintage cross with 12 original milagros from the 1940s sold for $650 at a folk art auction in 2024. The cross was never just decoration. It was a record of every prayer your family ever made. Number 1. Last Supper wall plaques. The Last Supper hung in the dining room. Not a painting, not a print. A three-dimensional plaque, usually resin or plaster, sometimes framed in carved wood, sometimes backed with velvet. It was the single most common piece of wall art in Mexican households from the 1950s through the 1990s. A new one cost $5 to $15 at the flea market. Vintage Last Supper plaques from before 1960 in original frames now sell between $200 and $1,500. The hand-painted plaster versions from Mexican workshops command the highest prices. A hand-painted resin Last Supper plaque from the 1940s with an original carved wood frame sold for $1,400 in 2023. But the value is not in the material. Every Mexican family who hung the Last Supper in the dining room was making a statement. This is a house where faith sits at the table. This is a house where the most important meal is the one shared with family. The plaque watched over every birthday, every Christmas Eve, every Sunday dinner for decades. It saw arguments and reconciliations. It saw children grow up and grandparents grow old. It hung there so long that the wall behind it stayed a different color when it was finally taken down. That is not a decoration. That is a witness. The brass sombrero still hangs on the wall. The plastic covers still crinkle when you sit down. The Loteria cards are still in a drawer somewhere in your mother's house. Here is my challenge. Go home this weekend. Walk through the rooms. Look at the walls, the shelves, the cabinets your family has not opened in years. Pick up the things they stopped noticing. Turn them over. Look at the marks on the bottom. Check what they are selling for. Then call your abuela and tell her she has been sitting on a fortune this whole time. Share which item from this list is still in your family's house in the comments. I want to know if the velvet paintings get more love than the Lili Ledy figures. I want to know if anyone still has an unbroken ceramic piggy bank. Because these are not just old things. They are proof that Mexican families turned ordinary houses into museums of pride, faith, and memory. One brass sombrero, one velvet painting, one prayer candle at a time.